All right, Termo to Madeline, page 296, chapter titled The One and Only John L. Nelson. Now, John Nelson, or as he's known as Deep Canyon Johnny, as some folks knew him, was a character to whom justice could not be done in a mere chapter. He was one of those individuals who became a legend in his own time, and his reputation went ahead of him wherever he went. John Nelson was a local likely boy who did not really become affiliated with Madeline until about 1910. It was at Madeline that he found his friends. Most everyone on the plains got along fine with John Nelson. It was the South Fork inhabitants who questioned his harum-scarum ways. John Nelson was born in South Fork Valley to Willie and Katie Nelson in 1889. It was there that he and his sister grew up during the years their father was in partnership with George Bailey on the Corporation Ranch. In those years, Bailey and Nelson were taking up land as fast as they could under the various homesteads and preemption acts. Willie Nelson obtained a lot of springs in the mountains all around Madeline in the 1880s. In 1891, he filed on a piece of land just 9 miles northeast of Madeline, in the bottom of the steepest, ruggedest, boxed-in canyon in the whole country. It was known as Deep Canyon, and was to become the home of John Nelson from 1910, when he first moved out there, until his death. Johnny Nelson grew up to have some odd characteristics that were not always well accepted by his South Fork neighbors. He wanted to live alone and away from people. He was a bachelor most of his life, although he did try the married life for about 8 months one time. Typical of some bachelors, he was not often clean, until he came to town to get to a dance. And the food he ate, unless cooked by one of his neighbors' wives, would have usually left a dog nauseated. But then, anyone who lived in Deep Canyon could not have had all the niceties of life. Deep Canyon runs at a slight angle to Cedar Creek Canyon for a couple of miles before the two join each other above West Valley. From the West Valley side, one could follow the canyon up to Johnny's camp on horseback with relative ease in those years. But coming out of the canyon to go toward Madeline was the steepest, rockiest, most hair-raising climb the average horseman ever cared to experience. Johnny Nelson, however, came out of that hole on the average of a couple of times a month, leading a pack of horses or two to pick up supplies at Madeline or to do some other business with his neighbors on the plains. That was the one outstanding quality that John Nelson. He was a horseman of unexcelled ability. He never rode a horse that anyone else would ride. His saddle horse had to have a sheer mean streak or something else wrong with him before Johnny Nelson would ever get on him. His love of horses was equaled only by his love for dancing. When he was riding for horses, he never missed one he was looking for. And when it came time for a dance at Termo or Madeline, or somebody's house, or wherever, he never missed one of those either. He danced with all the ladies, and they could vouch for the fact that his abilities, along with those lines, were unexcelled as well. But anyway, about his horse running. He ran his horses in the country between Deep Canyon and Cold Springs, and he had a lot of horses. He originally got started in the horse business after he moved to Deep Canyon to live there. He bought a bunch of horses from Jack Willards, a Pitt River Indian in Likely. That started his horse raising, and then in later years he got together a fair-sized bunch of cattle, too. Whatever he was doing, he always made his headquarters at Deep Canyon, with the exception of a year or so when he lived in Alturas. Raleigh Meeks helped him haul the lumber down into deep canyon to build his house when he first moved there. Meeks was a homesteader who lived in Cedar Creek Canyon and had a little dairy there. He was John's closest neighbor at the time. They lowered the boards down from the Madeline side. It had to have been easy to get the materials to the spring at the bottom where John built his house, but how they got them there in a condition suitable for building is open to everyone's speculation. Now, John Nelson made a lot of trips back and forth between Madeline and his Deep Canyon camp for one reason or another. The two places were only 9 miles apart as the crow flies, but since Johnny was not a crow, he had to make a detour around Tule Lake, which netted him another couple of miles each way. He managed to cut those 2 miles out in the winter, however. When things froze up, he could go straight across the Tule Lake on the ice. It was a logical enough thing to do. All the kids from Madeline spent their spare moments playing ice hockey there, and whoever was running the Madeline Hotel always harvested a large ice crop there to fill their ice house. And even a chicken knows that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But it still got Johnny Nelson in trouble one winter. It was cold, well below freezing, and there was snow on the ground. John came up horseback out of Deep Canyon, leading a pack mare. As usual for that time of year, he went straight out across Tule Lake. But as he was nearing the shore on the Madeline side, the ice gave way under John Nelson and his 2 horses. Saddle and pack outfit all went down with a tremendous splash. Luckily for them, Tule Lake was not as big and deep as the irrigation company thought it was going to be, because they all managed to keep their heads above water. Johnny, by standing up on top of his saddle horse, was able to slide out onto the ice and get out of the water. He did manage to get his saddle off his horse, but he could not seem to help the 2 animals. Besides, he was soaked, and the temperature was such that he was soon wanting help for himself more than the horses, so he struck off from Madeline at a fast pace. He came dragging into Bailey Place about an hour later, more dead than alive, but he was alive. Another saga in the legend of Johnny Nelson. For surely that little episode would have killed anyone else. Anyway, after he got changed into some warm, dry clothes, he and a couple of the Olson boys and Fred Schaefer rode back up to Tule Lake to try to save the horses. After a lot of work and sweat, they did succeed in getting John's saddle horse back on top of the ice, and they got the pack outfit off the pack animal, but that poor little pack mare was so weak from the cold and struggling to get out, as well as having cut herself up badly in struggling against that ice, that they finally had to shoot her. Whether John Nelson learned a lesson from the incident is doubtful. He went right on to doing crazy things that the average person would never have thought of doing, and his enemies continued to look down on him for it. But it was those crazy little things that he did, things that the average man did not have the guts or daring for, that gave his friends a reason to admire him. Next chapter titled The Lassen County Trading Company. The Lassen County Trading Company was first officially incorporated in November 4th, 1914, with $100,000 authorized capital. Harvey and Loa Fritz were the sole owners and proprietors. They had already been operating a store in Madeline and a large corrugated iron building which they had built. Now, with the formation of this company, they were authorized to handle livestock and real estate, as well as all other lines of merchandise generally associated with a general store. The following year, the Fritzes built a wooden building in the lot right next to their house on the east. From that time on, they used the old store as a warehouse. The Fritz family, by this time, was involved in about everything. Mr. Fritz, of course, was working as the NCO railroad agent, taking care of all their clerical work and telegraph dispatches, collecting freight charges and delivering freight and express. He was also running a band of sheep. Mrs. Fritz worked strictly in the store at this time. She hired various people to help her, but her most steady hired help was Hilda Olson and Harry Lee. Lennis Fritz was always away at school during the winter, but in the summertime it was always her job to take care of the housework, since her mother worked every day at the store. She would get up at 5 o'clock every morning and bake a couple of dozen loaves of bread, which she would sell in the store that day for 10 cents a loaf. And her younger brother, Elbert, did his part also. He had to get up around 4 o'clock to build the fire to heat the oven. Along about this time, Elbert, who was 10 years old, was also in the wood business with Cliff McCarter. They cut their own wood and sold a little on the side. It was a good business. The pine that they had cut up Dry Creek sold for $1 a cord. Juniper went for $1.50, and mahogany brought the high price of $2 a cord. But aside from all their varied activities, the Fritz's family's Lassen County Trading Company kept Madeline's needs supplied for over 20 years. A typical country general store, the company sold clothing, especially men's working clothing, hardware such as nails and bolts and screws, most any other kind of commodity or implement used on a farm, canned foods of all kinds produced in the summer, and potatoes the year round. Supplies from the store were shipped in on the NCO from Sacramento. Certain items were also brought in on the NCO from San Francisco and Reno. Most anything could be obtained from Lassen County Trading Company, and at a reasonable price, considering the distances involved in shipping materials in. Mrs. Fritz did not always sell Levi's at a reasonable price, however. Like always, with the rising cost of overhead, she raised the price of Levi's one year from $1.50 a pair to $1.75 a pair. The buckaroos around the Madeline cried for months afterward about that. Sometimes the prices may have had an effect on how quickly items in the store moved, too, like that 10 cents for a loaf of bread. One day a coyote trapper down at Ravendale asked Mrs. Fritz, "Do you keep bread in your store up at Madeline?" To which Mrs. Fritz replied, "No, we don't. We try to sell it." Next chapter, titled The NCO, A Tiny Giant. In a time when the nation was expanding westward on broad gauge rails using enormous locomotives to pull long, heavy freight and passenger trains, the Madeline Plains was still being served by a little, crooked and slow narrow gauge railway. The people on the plains were proud of the NCO, though. It was as if it was their own accomplishment. In a way it was. Local people provided the workforce for it, from agents to gandy dancers. Several local boys piloted the NCO's narrow gauge engines over 240 miles of difficult road between Reno and Lakeview. Local people complained about the slowness of the trains and lack of space and facilities in the little passenger cars, but it was nothing more than a joke with them. They were pioneers who were not used to fineries and the little niceties that city people had become accustomed to. They could joke about it among themselves, but all an outsider had to do to spark an instant argument was to downgrade the NCO in front of a local. Things were the same in the financial community. The big-time railroad promoters, who despised the little slow narrow gauges and wanted to see them all plowed under, were soon put to their place by the fanciers of the NCO. Yes, it was a tiny, outdated narrow gauge, and yes, it would have moved more traffic faster if it had been broad gauged, but its directors were not in the mood to spend a lot of money broad gauging it. The road was making profits in proportion to its sizes, and they were guaranteed. From the time the NCO reached Madeline in 1902 until 1912, the railroad netted $1.4 million. That was quite an accomplishment for a concern of that size, and it really did not matter that the large railroads were inconvenienced by the changeover where they crossed the NCO tracks. The NCO had a monopoly on all traffic into the Lakeview area, and none of the big roads had money enough to run a parallel track. So they grumbled, and the NCO went right on collecting the money. In 1912, the NCO got a rate hike in passenger travel approved by the Railroad Commission, adjusting the fare to 7 cents a mile. The following year of 1913, they were able to reduce their freight rates, giving Reno a chance to compete with the larger cities in Sacramento Valley as a distributing point. Along with this rate decrease, the state railroad commissioners granted the once again growing town of Termo a place on the map. They had removed the agent from Termo a couple of years before, but now they were willing to allow freight to be taken care of there. This provided a great service to the people in the general neighborhood of Bailey Creek, Termo, and Juniper Ridge. It provided a source of employment for local residents, Joe Brown, who was awarded the job of agent. Other local agents were H.J. Fitz and Madeline, and later, even though he was a mere boy, his son Elbert Fitz took the job of agent at Ravendale. There were 3 local boys who were engineers for the line: Tom Kaufman, Tom Smith, and Allie Smith. Tom Smith had grown up around Madeline and went to work for the NCO as a fireman in May of 1903, later working his way up to engineer. Tom Kaufman, an early-day Madeliner, started to work for the NCO just 1 month before Tom Smith in April of 1903. He, too, started out as a fireman and worked his way up to engineer. Floods on the Madeline and a shortage of help in an emergency helped promote him, and by March of 1904, he was the engineer of the company's construction train as repair crews patched up the flood-ravaged road. Allie Smith came to Brockman in the middle of the Homestead boom. He brought with him a steam-powered traction engine for farming, which he was quite adept at handling. When it became obvious to him that he could not make a living tilling the Madeline Plains adobe, it was a logical step for him to move into engineering on the railroad. 2 of the NCO's engineers, who were not necessarily local to the Plains, but who had been with the line from time it pulled into Madeline, were Bill Wemfrey and Sam Boney. They were loved and respected by the people of the Plains and fit in as if they were locals. Another individual who held the highest respect of the Madeline Plains people was conductor Sam Phelan. He was the conductor on the passenger trains, and although he was tough on free-riding hobos, he was well known by all local passengers, and they knew they were in good hands when he was handling the train. Weather was something that affected the trains even when the best of help was on hand. At times it helped an inspiring railroad worker to advance quickly, like Tom Kaufman did during the flood of 1904. But often weather and wilderness conditions were a detriment to employees and passengers alike. Without heavy equipment to make high-graveled roadbeds, snow and frost weakened the tracks, and at times it seemed the NCO engines spent more time down in the mud in the boral pits than they did on the rails. In that flood of 1904, which was especially bad around Long Valley, an engine and 2 flat cars were into the mud at Madeline. And to make things worse, the footings of Madeline's water tower sank and the tank toppled over into the mud and broke. It was times like this when passengers became workers. That year of 1904, the train got off the tracks below Termo also. Ravendale was not there yet, and Termo had temporarily become extinct. The closest civilization was Van Loan Station. So, if the passengers did not want to spend a couple of days and nights without food or normal shelter, all hands were required to help get the rails back in place and get the re-railing frogs in place under the engine to get it back on the tracks. Besides that, those were wood-burning engines in those years. When bogged down for any length of time, it required every able-bodied person aboard to pull sagebrush in order to keep the fire stoked and the boiler hot. That particular time, help did not arrive the second day. Elmer Van Loan could not get a stage through the gooey mud, but he sent a pack string laden with food down to the stricken train. As the years went along, conditions did improve. The NCO got oil-burning engines and continued to build up or reroute the worst spots of the road. But it was just a little line through some rough country, and mishaps continued to be commonplace. It seemed like poor Tom Kaufman got more than his share, generally not through any fault of his own. He and his firemen were both injured seriously and had to be hospitalized in Reno for a couple of weeks when the down train that Kaufman was running left the tracks near the Nevada line on May 8th, 1907, and smashed into the ditch. In a little less than 2 months, Tom was backed up and running the construction train on the new extension progressing toward Likely. The NCO added as much comfort and convenience to the line as possible, like the gasoline-motor-powered touring bus, which came onto the tracks early in the Homestead days. But in spite of the innovations, the NCO continued to be slow. The addition of the sleeping and dining car to the passenger trains in April of 1912 inspired statements such as the following. In the local newspaper it read, quote, "Now that the NCO has provided a dinner sleeper, passengers will be less tempted to get off and push." Now, the following year, the loss of a small child out of a passenger car window brought on this sarcasm from the Reno Gazette-Journal. Quote, "Child tries to run down the NCO train." And it has an article here, which I'm not going to read. So the NCO was slow. It was small and cramped. It ran in a tough, inhospitable terrain. It required the help of everybody around to keep it rolling. But it was still the best darn piece of modernization the Madeline Plains had ever seen. End of this chapter, page 311. Next time we'll continue with chapter titled The Philman Tragedy. The Philman Tragedy, page 311.